Hello and good morning, everybody. I hope people are starting to join us for the session on transition. My name's Suzanne Ofarrell and I'm ASCL's consultant for modern languages really at the moment. And it's nice to see people joining on this wet and windy Sunday morning halfway through lockdown. Just so that I hope you can all hear me okay. Perhaps you could just let me know in the chat if there's any problems with that for that. And if you could just let me know where you're from actually in the chat as well. It'd be really lovely to see where we've got people. I can see that we've got people from Manchester, we've got people from Portugal, which is really good. We've got Wales, which is my home country. For that, that's good. And well, coming in from Leicester and Spain as well. So really good to see everybody joining me this morning. So you might not know about ASCL. ASCL is the Association of School and College Leaders. And we've got 19,000 members, mainly people who are in school as leaders. And we're one of the 5 organisations recently that has contributed towards the National Strategy for Languages, which was launched in the summer of 2020. We're still waiting a major launch when restrictions are lifted. But I hope you've had a chance to look at that national strategy. And one of the recommendations in that is about primary languages and about transition and working towards some effective transition like that. So I'm going to, my background is in languages, secondary head teacher, and obviously being a curriculum specialist for ASCL. And I'm going to take you through a project this morning, which might offer some hope towards what we can do and tackle some of those historic barriers facing transition between primary and secondary schools with languages. So really nice to see so many people joining us, and I'm going to start sharing my slides in a moment or two, and I will come back to questions then at the end. So if you've got some questions, if I can keep an eye on them, do pop them in the Q&A, and we'll see how we go on. So oh, I can see, yeah, nice to see people, some people I recognise that's joining the chat as well. That's really, really lovely. So ever so pleased that you managed to join on the Sunday, and hope you find interesting what we've got to say. So I'll start sharing my slides now. So there we are. I hope that's worked, and you've got my details there should you need them for that, and the background for ASCL. So I've entitled this The Missing Link, and it's a project that has been developed actually by the ASCL along with the primary steering group for the Association for Language Learning, and I'm really indebted to them for their expert input into finalising this project. And it's been funded by a charity that ASCL supported ASCL really for a long time, the Esme Fairbairn, and we have a dedicated charity to promote languages in the primary sector. So anything involved in that that we want to do, and obviously we see languages in ASCL as part of a very rich curriculum all the way through. And my aim really is to try and get and increase the uptake in schools, primary, secondary, and anything we can do post 16 as well for languages. So that's the background of the project. Excuse me. And what we've produced then with the project is what I think is a very practical and flexible toolkit aimed at supporting transition. Now, this is freely available to download on the ASCL website and on the Association for Language Learning website. And it's available in 3 languages, French, German, and Spanish. And we think it's very simple, very effective, and actually could be mutually beneficial for secondary colleagues, for primary colleagues, but the main beneficiaries, I think, will be pupils who will continue their language journey and maintain that upward gradient of learning in languages. So that's a little bit about it, and I'll show you some of it as we go through. If we just start a minute with looking at the research about primary languages, and there's been so much valuable research published recently, and we know from Florence Miles's research that actually towards the end of primary experience, pupils really understand how language is working. They're aware of language as knowledge. They're aware of what they know. They're aware of what they don't know. They're aware of the progress they're making around that. They're aware of the intrinsic value of actually learning a language as well. And it's even more important then that we should try and sustain that motivation as pupils move from primary to secondary, and that they don't just start from scratch again. This really does lead to a downturn in motivation. And I think, you know, as an ex-secondary head seeing this, it doesn't put languages then on the same par as other subjects when they're coming in to their secondary experience, if there is that downturn and that restart from scratch all over again. And I'll talk about some of the problems with that in a moment. And I think also all of us understand the cognitive benefits of learning a language. There's been so much recent research published about this, how important and how pupils, and well, not only pupils, but adults can benefit from language learning. And I think too, as linguists, we all appreciate the joy and curiosity amongst all pupils in learning about how pupils in different countries think, and you know what they do and what their school experience is like, etc. So that curiosity, really, I don't think we'll find a child who isn't keen on learning about that. So lots of reasons, lots of research about primary languages that's emerging. And then if we look at the white paper that was published in 2019, a really, really fantastic piece of work by the Ripple Group. And that really does highlight some of these historic barriers that I alluded to earlier that we've got in transition, that we're always talking about transition, we're always trying to find a solution to it. And really we've got variability of pupil progress, we've got variance in the number of feeder schools, we've got mixed age teaching, we've got specialist and non-specialist input, we've got different allocation of time put into being able to do languages, and often the problem that we do one language in primary and then people start a completely different language in secondary. So how can we offer some solutions there with all of those complexities involved in that? And I do think if Key Stage 2 learning is to be beneficial, it really must try and be built on in some way in the secondary sector. And I think part of it is understanding, for our secondary colleagues, understanding the pupil journey that's happened in primary. And that's where the toolkit comes in, and it can offer something to start that shared dialogue, to have that conversation, virtually or non-virtually at the moment, about that pupil journey and how we can build on that in secondary and try and maintain that motivation for language learning as well. And another recommendation in the white paper, you can see there, was that primary schools providing secondaries with a clear statement of what pupils have been taught. And I think the toolkit offers the possibility for that, because it does act as some sort of baseline, really, of what pupils could realistically expect to have explored and retained by the end of 4 years of learning languages in secondary, in primary. So it must be built on and as part of that journey, really. And it's, as I said, it's available in French, German, and Spanish. And the toolkit, even though we know at the moment that the main language taught in primary is French, and actually, according to the British Council trends last year, the language then that's most taught in secondary at the moment, at the beginning of secondary experience, is Spanish. The toolkit can take account into that variance as well, and I'll explain that as I go through. So just looking at last year's British Council language trends, it's quite a depressing picture in terms of transition and continuity of learning. And we can see there that the findings state that transition remains underdeveloped. Around that, there's no national strategy for implementation for transition. And in fact, the second bullet point there shows that language, the contact between primary and secondary is in fact reducing compared to a few years ago. And no doubt that's due to various pressures as well. So you can see now there's even less contact. And in fact, where information is shared, it tends to be informal information that is actually being done, nothing formalized really, and very variable across the patch, really across the whole of the United Kingdom, or England in particular, we're talking about here. So no coherent strategy for transition, and that does remain the biggest barrier, I think, in all the work that we do in that sector. We've got the national curriculum that we've had for a good number of years now, and that too then talks about establishing the foundations of how to learn a language and talks about making substantial progress. Now that's, you know, we all look at that phrase and we think, well, what does that mean? And in actual fact, it's been deliberately, well, it's been left open in policy. There is no clear understanding of what we think substantial progress is, because I think of the variance in approach and some of the issues I outlined earlier around specialist input, lack of specialist input in some ways, mixed age planning, variability in time allocation and pupil progress, and the number of different sort of feeder schools feeding into one. So it is difficult to do that. However, I think the toolkit does give some illustration of what you could reasonably expect pupils to have explored and retained by the end of 4 years in primary, sort of what's left in the sieve really after those 4 years. And we know now as well that the ambition there is on the part of the government for the current year 3 pupils to be moving right through the secondary experience and taking a language up to 16 as part of their EBAC ambition. So that in mind does affect those pupils in year 3. I also think since the publication of this document, there is now much more focus in the primary sector on the whole breadth of the curriculum around that. So, you know, not just sort of English and maths, but certainly looking at revisiting this and really focusing on all the foundation subjects and languages in particular in the primary sector, and on transition, which is again where the toolkit can help that dialogue between secondaries and primaries. Still sort of talking about the sort of recommendations there have been for transmission right across the piece, I'm going to refer now to the Modern Languages Pedagogy Review that was published in 2016, and you can see there as well the same recommendation cropping up about secondary schools knowing about the pupil journey, building on this, maintaining that upward gradient of learning. And you know, it is the fact that transition does need to be more of a process than an event, with far more progress emphasis on that progression, if we can get that working for us in whatever way it works, however limited, some sort of baseline so that pupils aren't starting from scratch. And I think that the toolkit offers the opportunity for that really as we move through. Just another point really which emphasizes where we are in a slightly different terrain at the moment. We're thinking about our curriculum, and everybody wants to, well, everybody is busy building a curriculum designed around what we think we want pupils to know and pupils to build on and develop over time around that. And curricula are being developed now in such a way that are helping pupils remember things over a long period of time, really. And with that in mind, transition, I think, becomes even more important, because if your curriculum has been designed in primary to ensure that pupils have retained, you know, sort of a core knowledge at the end of their primary experience through the revisiting and repeating of that, then it's even more important that we perhaps try and build on that foundation that pupils have got, where, irrespective of the language, when they move from primary to secondary. We can also think then about the revised inspection framework. We know from Michael Wardle's excellent work on this really, that they are focused on those 3 pillars of progression: phonology, vocabulary, and grammar. And the toolkit actually mirrors those areas as well: phonology and grammar. It doesn't specify core vocabulary, but all the skills are retained within those: phonology, grammar, and vocabulary. So there is that opportunity as well, where it mirrors what you might expect to be looking at in terms of progression, really, from one phase to another. We also know that the new inspection framework is looking at transition as well between primary and secondaries. And again, that phrase that I've referred to a couple of times, of the toolkit representing what is left in the sieve after 4 years of primary languages. It's also worth perhaps focusing a little bit, before we get to it, on the research that's come out from the National Centre of Language Learning in York, really, about how pupils learn a second language. And this is sort of really interesting, really, and again has resonance with the toolkit. there is some, feedback that actually pupils' perception of learning, of the explicit way in which they're taught grammar at Key Stage 2 is part of the Key Stage 2 literacy as well. Pupils have responded quite well to that. They like having a structure. They like the fact that it's explicitly taught. They like the fact there's clearly defined rules as well that they can pick up. They have the sort of language to, technical language to understand that, and they appreciate these clearly defined and explicit ways of being taught grammar for that. And if we think now that Key Stage 2 teachers of subjects, all subjects, are all expert in teaching literacy, and we can maximize the potential, I think, for that in second language learning. But pupils develop that ability to be able to spot patterns. They appreciate the consistent terminology being used. And of course, in the toolkit, you have got a consistent terminology that you can use in both primary and secondary sectors, which was one of the recommendations that came out from the National Pedagogy Review as well, about that consistent language being used between the sectors. I also think, and this came out from the research, that explicit teaching of grammar for pupils is quite a leveler. It's quite democratizing. It gives everybody the same opportunity to learn that and that too can help, I think, with language learning. So it's a really interesting emerging research coming out about how pupils learn a second language there, which we're building on as well. So the toolkit, what exactly is the ASCL and ALL toolkit? Well, it aims to provide secondary colleagues with an actionable base to build upon, really, so they can organize learning in a way which enables pupils to demonstrate what they already know and have retained from their primary experience of language learning. It is available with, it specifies, and I'll show you the next slide in a moment, some sort of core knowledge that you might realistically expect pupils to know, and then teachers can drag that knowledge across into the blank boxes and populate that with what their pupils have done in their primary learning experience, in their primary languages. It can be added to, it can be amended, it can be deleted. It's this drag and drop feature, so they can select the grammar, vocabulary, phonology, everything that's been afforded, just drop that into the blank areas around that, and then they can pass that on to secondary. So it does enable you to sort of see whether there have been issues with variability of pupil progress. And when you've got a large number of feeder schools, if you've got one transition document coming in, and you can have a look and determine the overlap then that pupils have done in, so that they've all done this little part, or they all know that part of the language, or they've covered that bit of the phonemes there, the phonics in that. So secondaries can have a look and determine the overlap quickly, and so you've got some sort of baseline, something to build on at all, and it's a beginning, it's a starting point, it's starting to share the dialogue around that. So, and I'll give you, and it just gives pupils a far more joined up experience, really, and I think that's what we're aiming for. Pupils are central to this, having a far more joined up experience of their primary and secondary pupil language learning experience, and provide genuine continuity of learning, because far too often we're starting from scratch again, and we're not looking at even the tiniest of details really to build upon. And so even if pupils aren't continuing with the same language, and I've already said that sort of the issues we've got at the moment is that French seems to be the dominant languages in primary, but actually, in fact, there's more and more Spanish being taught in secondary. I think, and this is already happening, and schools are already doing this. So this is not, in any way designed to sort of not reinforce what's being already happened. But, it is worth bearing in mind and perhaps pointing out that actually all those language learning strategies pupils have got could be effectively built on. And if they understand something conceptual in one language, it's very, very easily transferred to another, and progress can be quicker around that. So if I sort of give you an example on the next slide of what I mean by that, a pupil starting a new language in year 7, well, they've already got that natural curiosity about the language that their new language. They're familiar with maybe patterns and the numbers and the genders and adjectives changing position, phonemes, and if you know what they've learned from the toolkit in that language, and then you know that they can know the verbs to be, for example, in whatever language that is, or whatever that is in German or Spanish, then you can make those links, those valuable links that are so crucial in language learning around that, and you can refer to what they already know in the one language, and then you can apply that very, very quickly to reinforce that concept in the new language. So again, I think that there are ways around this that we can still, not ignore what pupils have done, but build on it in a way that shows the pupils really that they're on this journey of language learning, and there is more continuity than they might have previously had around that. So I think they're receptive to it. We can do it in a far more explicit way than we've perhaps done before, and really exploit that curiosity that pupils have about their language learning. So this is what the toolkit looks like. So you've got, this is just one sort of part of it, and you can see under the grammar, we have listed what we think might be a reasonable expectation for pupils to know by the end of 4 years, and that one there. And then we give an example in the middle column, and it is only an example. So it doesn't. You could find obviously different examples there around that, but it gives you that we've sort of tried to think of the language that would be used in primary, and this is where I've been hugely grateful to be able to draw on the support of the Association of Language Learning's primary steering group to really determine and select that key language that we've put in there. So it's not a particularly long document, and you can see there, you can just drag that across then, or copy and paste it across into the final box really, and that is the document that you would send up to your secondary school with any relevant contextual information that you wanted to do that. So we've got their numbers, we've got plurals, we've got nouns, gender, we've got subject pronouns. This is just the French one, obviously, and it lists the things like the high frequency verbs that you might expect people to know, what to expect, you might be familiar with them, and the regular verbs. So again, it gives you a sort of baseline of the language that you could reasonably have covered in that, and the core phrases and the standard terminology that's there as well. So you can use it in all sorts of different ways really for this, but it's there for that, it's designed by the profession for the profession, and we want really to try and take ownership, I think, of transition, and it's a starting point. We know the problems with it. I think if transition had been that easy, we would have come up with a solution by now, because we've been talking about it for a long time. But this is something that could eventually be some sort of national baseline with people using it freely available. In the first part, so it comes in two parts. It comes with an information paper that gives you an outline for it, and then it comes with the actual toolkit. So in the information paper at the beginning, this is just an idea of what it sort of covers. I mean, that's a long list, or it looks a long list, but in actual fact, the toolkit isn't particularly long, but it does cover those things, and it gives you an idea of the sorts of things that you might cover. And there's classroom language there as well. It's got the standard terminology, etc. Well, you can see yourselves there the sorts of things that might cover. And at the end of it as well, we've also included cultural awareness, whatever you refer that to. We've just thought of, okay, at the end of Key Stage 2, what might pupils have learned about the culture of the country that they are studying as well. So you can just see that, and that's available for all 3 languages as well. And then we come to what I think is a really interesting part of the toolkit. This is in the information paper at the beginning, and this has arisen from a request from ASCL school leaders, where they're thinking about the provision for their primary language learning, and they wanted some sort of guide about resources. So what we've collated there, along with the Association for Language Learning, and in fact the really valuable input from the cultural institutions, the 3 cultural institutions, is an appendix which lists the resources, the schemes really, that we would recommend ASCL ALL both free resources, there's huge amounts of free resources and commercial resources. So if you're thinking, what's the best thing to look at, it's worth maybe just having a look. It's all in one place, all the resources in one place, all the schemes that you might want to have a look at and contrast and compare and decide what's right for you, with all the relevant links there as well. And both of those are on the ASCL and the ASSL website. And that's just the one there for German, for example, for you. So I think really, I've mentioned this pupil journey, and I think that is really what I mean. It's a tremendous opportunity in teaching languages in the primary sector to think, what am I doing now that is going to eventually create these curious and keen language learners in year 7 when they go on and leave us and go on to take languages further, really. And we've got the opportunity to awaken a lifelong interest in language learning, which I think is perhaps more important now than it ever has been. And I also think that successful uptake at secondary is underpinned by a really successful transition process and a successful experience in primary. And as people move from one meaningful experience to another, really, for that, and put our subject on the same footing as every other subject, where there is that continuity of learning and that that upward gradient where we are building on, however small a base it is, there is some recognition of the explicit way in which they've learned and taught and retained some knowledge moving forward for that. And I think it is time for that shared dialogue around the toolkit to make those stronger links between the two sectors, which we've seen are eroding for all sorts of reasons at the moment. So I'm just going to spend the final couple of minutes talking perhaps a little bit about the elephant in the room, about assessment. And this is something new that's on the horizon as well, because we talk about transitions and everyone says, well, what about assessment? And I'm just going to show you something that's arisen as a result of the pandemic, actually, to do with school-to-school sharing of information that ASCL worked collaboratively with last year with AskEdi, with a platform. We're going to trial it for languages for this year. So we'll be looking for some volunteers for things on the horizon. So this is brand new, and you might not have heard of this before. So last year, when we had the so first of all, carrying on, the schools were closed for a long period of time, and there were no Key Stage 2 tests. And we still wanted to share that information between primary and secondaries, for English and maths, for all sorts of purposes. What ASCL did was got together with AskEdi, and they did a virtual platform, a sort of simple solution where there were criteria designed by teachers, that the actual criteria, professional judgments that teachers then made about the progress of their pupils in English and maths. They uploaded this very, very quickly and simply into the pupil names and the attainment scores into a virtual very secure database. And at a click of a button, all of that information then was shared from primary schools to secondary schools, and enabled secondary schools then to do what they would normally do with their Key Stage 2 tests. So in the absence of Key Stage 2 tests, we came up with a profession-led solution whereby we shared valuable information about what we thought people should know and retain in English and maths by the end of Key Stage 2, and that was uploaded to the platform. And we had 1,000 schools take part in that last year, and you can see some of the information there. And it proved tremendously successful. You can see in the next slide some of the feedback that we had from that, around that for people that took part in it. So it was a conversation really essentially about primary and secondary in order to get pupils the best start in secondary. So the teaching picked up from where it left off. And it was all, we still had that data sharing around that really. So it facilitated transition, it kept the continuity of learning going, and it worked really well. So this year, we're going to add primary languages to that platform, really. So this is not it, this is a very, very simple illustration of what it will be. But we are at if anybody is interested in sharing that information, as well as, they were doing it anyway for English and maths, so we thought we'll trial and see what it's like for languages. So we're going to look at phonology, grammar, vocabulary, and cultural awareness. So those 3 strands that are in the toolkit, the 3 strands that are the pillars of progression that Ofsted are focusing on as well, all then carried through. And we've come up with the criteria of what we think that might look like to be, secure, not secure, high ability. And then you could pass that on then from primary to secondary at a touch of a button. We will, I think, make sure there's plenty of opportunities with sort of drop-down boxes for contextual information to be added, so that how much input have pupils had, whether it's been a specialist teacher, what language, how much time in a week, whether it's been one language or more than one language, etc. So people can get a realistic picture of what the primary experience has been like around that. So that's something that's on the horizon for 2021, and who knows if we'll have any key stage 2 tests anyway next year. We're still waiting to find out about that. So that's finally, so all the information is there on with the links on the ASCL website for any of that you want to download. We've also got links there to ASCL's Discovering Language program, which is a multi-language program, and some resources there that we do in primary, and obviously everything to do with that open data project that I've just mentioned in the last couple of minutes as well. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing there, and then I'm going to have a look at see if we've got some questions in the Q&A. So if you do have any questions in there, just do pop them in at the moment, and I'll see. Give me a couple of minutes to come, and I'm happy to pick up those questions. Or I'll have a look in the chat to see if there's anything in the chat there. Don't seem to have any questions in the chat at the moment. I'll have a look to see if there's anything. I mean, in the Q&A at the moment. One of the questions I've got is the toolkit only used in England? The toolkit has only just been produced for the last couple of months, so it's freely available to anybody to use anywhere. We're not precious about it. It's completely, it's just really to help the profession. So if you find it useful to adapt and use in any way, to benchmark some progress, to adapt and think, oh well, it's a starting conversation. It's just designed really to be a conversation, a starting point. And of course, now the world we live in with all virtually, it could be done like that as well. But it would be great to see some schools using it, and some schools from secondary and primary. So it's not one way, it's a two-way process really. And I think this is the beauty about this. It's two-way. It's not really sort of secondaries telling primaries. You could have a dialogue. You could even determine what language really you wanted. Primaries could have some sort of input as to what they would like primaries to cover, if they, depending on how many feeder schools they've got, and highlight various aspects of the toolkit. Well, actually, this language would be really beneficial, and how well have pupils explored and retained this, and then secondaries taking on board the terminology that's been used in primaries and trying to reinforce that in their teaching for that. So I think that that is something that you could do with it. So it's free to adapt. It's a starting point. We could modify it and change it in times, but we would try and and see how it goes. I think I've got another question. How do we encourage primary to value language learning more for that? I do think the tide, I mean, I've got to be optimistic. I think all language teachers are optimistic. I think the tide is turning a little bit, because the lever inevitably will be the fact that now it's the breadth and depth of the curriculum of primary that is being looked at really from policy perspective. With Ofsted, we know that they went in and did a pilot of languages, looked at a pilot of language learning last year. We haven't yet had the published findings due to everything that's happened from that last year, but there's far more of a spotlight now on transition, a spotlight on the breadth of the whole primary curriculum, and not just sort of not teaching languages because you're focusing on other subjects. So I think there is far more the tide is turning really, and it's good news for languages, really good news for languages. So and of course we've got the centre in York as well around that. We've got that government ambition for more and more pupils to do it, and I think with Brexit on the horizon, it's so important that we do have such a that pupils value and enjoy language learning all the way through, and that we do sustain that motivation. And that's what this is about, really. It's about acknowledging, putting our subject on a par with other subjects that have been, so that pupils hit the ground running when they join secondary, however small a part it is that we start off with. I'm not sure I've got any more questions there. I think how will a secondary school cope? Yeah, I mean, I think if we can get more schools using it, we'll just have to get the word out there, really. It'd be great if secondaries and primaries could start to use it, and then they could modify that, really. But as I say, we haven't long been publishing it, and we'd like, even if there are numbers of feeder schools, you've got the same document coming in from everybody, that you could determine some overlap in the learning very, very easily, and without it being too time consuming. I've got another question here. Do we think primary students can make substantial progress if they study French in year 3 and 4 and Spanish in year 5 and 6? This is this is really interesting, because I think that they can. And I heard Michael Wardle, the HMI for Languages, being asked this question directly not so long ago, and he too admitted, provided there is, because you've learned one language, you've got some of those strategies I was talking about earlier in the presentation, and then you're more receptive to the language that you pick up in 5 and 6. So I still think that you could, with a carefully sequenced program, building in some of that grammar progression, and acknowledgements about the strategies they've got, about how they retain, how they learn new language, what they they come across, that I still think you could. But obviously it depends on the specialist, how much time you've got, expertise, your resources, that you're willing, and how you've designed and planned it as well. So yes, I think that you could, and I think that is accepted around that. I don't think, somebody's asked me whether the languages could be added to stats. I don't think that would be the case, because I think at the moment people are aware that actually it's very, very difficult. It's difficult. We've got a shortage of language teachers, so we haven't got enough language teachers, sadly, to deliver a secondary experience completely consistently across the country, and to do that in primary, which is why there's nothing really defined in primary at the moment as such. So I don't think that there would be any move to try and do that. This is about us as teachers, the profession, doing something and taking ownership of something that we believe in ourselves as linguists, and taking that forward, because we think that that pupil journey all the way through is important, and that's what we want to preserve, really. So I think that's most of the questions I've answered there around that. I do think I think I put my email in the presentation and around that. So if you do want any help with it, or in any questions or anything that you have, or you'd like to trial it, you want some advice around that, please do get in touch with us. We're just very pleased to have had the opportunity to make some contribution into this discussion about transition, and who knows, it might lead to something else, really, if other people, because I'm saying, adapt it and think, well, this is a better way of doing something. We'd be really open to learning about that. So I'm going to, I think I've got a couple of minutes, but I haven't got any more questions. I'm going to say goodbye, and hope that you found it of interest. Somebody's asking me about, the last thing is, where can you find a presentation? All the presentations, as I understand it from the organisers of the language show, will be available later today, so you can re-watch, and you can get the links or things around that. And that last slide, as I say, it's got all the links in. But if you just searched on ASCL Transition Toolkit, you will find all the links there as well, and you can download French, German and Spanish versions, even if it's just the resources, we're all collated in one place as well. That could be useful for schools to think about. So enjoy the rest of your day or any of the presentations, and thank you very much for joining me this morning. I really, really appreciate it. And I'll say goodbye. So bye everyone.